Hello. My name is Kyle Swan, and I'm an enrolled member of the Piscataway Conoy tribe. If you could please stand with me if possible so I can proceed. Thank you. We acknowledge the grounds that we are currently on are the ancestral grounds of the Piscataway people. We acknowledge that our people lived here and made footsteps through these lands for thousands of years before the colonists landed on our lands. We acknowledge that our lands of our ancestors cover all of the western bank of the Chesapeake, including all of southern Maryland, which is Charles, Calvert, and St. Mary's counties, Howard County, Anne Arundel County, Prince George's County, Montgomery County, Baltimore City, and Baltimore County. This is also Frederick County, Washington County, Carroll counties, as well as Washington, D.C., and into Virginia, the Northern Virginia, the Northern Neck, and parts of the Panhandle of Western Virginia. We acknowledge that these lands of the Piscataway are the unceded lands of these present-day counties. We acknowledge that there were multiple treaties entered into with our people, and all were broken until Washington, D.C. restored our fishing rights last year. We acknowledge that our people were not citizens of this very land that was stolen from them until 1920 and did not own land of their own. We acknowledge that many of these people did not receive acknowledgement until the 1950s and 60s, until the civil rights movements. We recognize that millions of people came and continue to come to this country for religious freedom, and it wasn't until 1978, when the American Indian Freedom Religious Act was passed, did our people, along with Native Americans around the country, were allowed to exercise their traditional religions by ensuring access to sites, use and possession of sacred objects, and the freedom to worship through ceremonial and traditional rites. We acknowledge that our people were here for thousands of years before the colonists and were not recognized as a tribe along with the Piscataway Indian Nation until 2012, when Governor O'Malley granted our Maryland state recognition. After fighting for 40 to 50 years to be recognized, we acknowledge that neither the Piscataway Conoy tribe nor the Piscataway Indian Nation currently have federal recognition, this after being one of the tribes of first contact. We acknowledge that the Piscataway citizens of both tribes currently have to pay taxes on the stolen land of their ancestors. We acknowledge that no other race of people have to prove who they are. Thank you.
We have before us a momentous opportunity to create the world's first truly interfaith nation. We need to build American Medina, a city on a hill made holy by the wideness of its welcome, the strength of its bonds. Look at it shining. The Catholic university where Muslim immigrants learn, the Jewish hospital where Hindu babies are born. The eyes of the world are upon you. We need to build a Sangha whose chants of loving kindness change the climate, bridge divides and bind hearts. We need to build the beloved community where we see each other, the Baptists and Mormons who farm fields and fight fires together, the witnesses who watch over the whole block. We need to build the New Jerusalem, tents for angels to dwell, tabernacles for the tribes. 12,000, 12 million, they will not cease to be diverse. They come from across the earth, seeking the sacredness of knowing one another. Every refugee a pilgrim, every stranger a friend, until we are a nation. This Interfaith America, pluralist Rashtra, diverse democracy, achieving our country, where our hopes are prophecies, where we offer Longar to our friends and our enemies, where we do not wait for sickness to pray for one another's health, where we defeat the things we do not love by building the things we do. We need to build. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Good evening, everybody. Tonight, we shift old paradigms and we name new paradigms. My name is Eboo Patel. I'm founder and president of Interfaith America, and I'm proud to partner here with my friend Karenna Gore, the Center for Earth Ethics, Ibrahim Abdul-Matin, Vice President Gore, and a host of terrific people to bring you tonight's program. The United States is the most religiously diverse nation in human history, the world's first attempt at religiously diverse democracy. We have seen faith be a bludgeon of domination in this nation's history. We have known faith to be a barrier of division. We have also known it to be a bridge of cooperation, and we must make it so again and again in the future. Too often, the story of religious freedom and interfaith cooperation that is told in this nation is a white story. The Flushing Remonstrance and Roger Williams, through Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, Jane Addams and John Kennedy, Diana Eck and Paul Knitter, these are all important figures. And there is a larger story of religious freedom and interfaith cooperation, of Esteban looking to his Sufi Muslim Moroccan roots and using those to integrate into indigenous tribes. The story of slaves from West Africa, animist and Christian and Muslim traditions, trading cultures and songs and rituals and practices that grew to become mainstream culture in America. The blues, the jazz, hip hop, on and on. These are the stories that will be told in this program, particularly as they relate to the climate crisis. The Black Interfaith Initiative of Interfaith America is one of our signature programs. It recognizes that the most inspiring crossing of religious divides has happened in the African American experience. And the most important bridges that have been built within that experience and beyond it. We are Interfaith America because of the Black experience. It is time to center that in our cultural conversations, in our theological conversations, and our ethical conversations, and in the work that we do to address the crisis that is before all of us, the crisis of climate change. I am thrilled to thank the colleagues on Interfaith America's staff for all the work that has gone into this program. I am thrilled to invite on stage my friend and colleague, Reverend Fred Davie, Senior Advisor for Racial Equity at Interfaith America, who will tell you a little bit about the program and introduce Vice President Gore. Thank you.
Good evening, and thank you, Eboo, and thanks all of you for coming out tonight. I want to start by thanking Eboo Patel for the insight to come up with this program focusing on Black interfaith in America. And I want to say another word about that shortly, and then you'll hear more about it as the program progresses. But I want to give him the credit for having been the inspiration behind Interfaith America initiating this conversation and this work around Black interfaith in the United States. Let me also thank Vice President Gore, whom I'll introduce shortly, and our panelists, especially Karenna Gore, who directs the Center of Earth Ethics at Union Theological Seminary in New York, and who is a co-sponsor of the event tonight, as many of you know. I want to thank our friends here at the Smithsonian Museum and the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and for hosting us tonight and being so gracious to have us here in this really wonderful and special place in our nation. I particularly want to acknowledge those members of the Black Interfaith Program Steering Committee who are also associated with the Smithsonian. Peter Mansell, Eric Williams, and Sabrina Motley are all staff here at the Smithsonian and also on our steering committee for the Black Interfaith Program. And then I'd like to acknowledge other members of the Black Interfaith Steering Committee as well. And I'm actually going to ask all the steering committee members, as well as the Black Interfaith Fellows who are here in the audience, if you'll just stand. I see some of you, so if you'll just stand and let us give you. Thank you. Thank you all for being here. We could not be here tonight without the generous partnership and support of the Luce Foundation. And we have a true partner in Luce in that their program officer who's in charge of this work, Jonathan Van Antwerpen, has been a real colleague in the development of this program and in other programs and relationships with what is now Interfaith America as well. Jonathan is here tonight, and I'd like him to stand too, and let's acknowledge him, Dr. Jonathan Van Antwerpen. Jonathan, thank you. A lot of work, as you probably know, went into making tonight possible, and a lot of that happened with the team at IFYC. There are many people at IFYC, or Interfaith America, excuse me, that I could acknowledge. But let me acknowledge the core team for the real energy and work and creativity that they put into this. The Reverend Alexis Vaughn, who's the Director of Equity, Racial Equity Initiatives, from whom you'll hear shortly. Terry Simon and Janelle Jefferson. They really coordinated this work and made it happen, so I want to thank them as well. And then just a word about the Black Interfaith Program before I introduce Vice President Gore. It's really important for us to center and understand Black interfaith cooperation as a phenomenon unto itself. It started with the advent of Black people of African descent on these shores in the 1600s. As our friend and colleague, Dr. Yolanda Pierce, reminded us that we did not come to these shores as empty vessels. We came with traditional African religions, we came with Islam, and all of that had an impact on how we evolved and developed as a people. The nation has not spent a lot of time focused on that history and its influence and impact. And part of the genius of this work, I think, is the fact that we're doing that now. Not only just to look at history and understand that history, but to see how it's working and playing out now in our current realities, to see how it intersects with the many different aspects of American life and the life of the world. And then to share how it can continue to resource us. This experience of Black interfaith cooperation can continue to resource the nation as we move forward and find our way in these very troubled, often very troubled times. One area where that is really important and is rare is in the area of the climate crisis. The presence, the Black presence around and in this issue has not been as prominent and as significant as it perhaps could have been and should have been. We're seeking to change that, and we're particularly seeking to change it not just from one faith perspective, but from the many faith perspectives that make up the Black community in America. So that's what we want to do here tonight. We want to talk about how Black interfaith intersects with an effort to address the issues of climate change and climate crisis. And we're so pleased to have with us one of the people who has been the leader in addressing the issue of climate change and the climate crisis, and that is the former Vice President of the United States of America, Al Gore. Just a word about former Vice President Gore. He is a founding partner and chairman of Generation Investment Management and the founder and chairman of the Climate Reality Project, on whose board I'm proud to serve. It's a nonprofit devoted to solving the climate crisis. He is also senior partner at Kleiner, Perkins, Caulfield, and Byers, and a member of Apple's board of directors. Mr. Gore was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1976, 1978, 1980, and 1982, and to the U.S. Senate in 1984 and 1990. He was inaugurated as the 45th Vice President of the United States on January 20, 1993, and served for 8 years. He is the author of the #1 bestseller, An Inconvenient Truth, and The Assault on Reason, and the bestsellers, Earth in the Balance, Our Choice, A Plan to Solve the Climate Crisis, The Future, 6 Drivers of Global Change, and most recently, the New York Times bestseller, An Inconvenient Sequel, Truth to Power. He is the subject of the documentary, An Inconvenient Truth, which won 2 Oscars in 2006, and a second documentary in 2017, An Inconvenient Sequel, Truth to Power. In 2007, Mr. Gore was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, along with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, for, quote, informing the world of the dangers posed by climate change, unquote. I now present to you former Vice President of the United States, a leader, the leader, in addressing the issues of climate change around the world, Vice President Al Gore.
Thank you very much. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for inviting me to take part in this event, and thank you, Fred, for such a warm introduction. It's an honor to work with you, and I'm incredibly grateful for your friendship and for your work as a board member of the Climate Reality Project. And before I start, I'd also like to thank Eboo, Patel, and Fred for the invitation to keynote this event. I want to thank the Center for Earth Ethics for their collaboration in hosting this event, and of course, its founder and chair, Karenna Gore, my daughter. Karenna and I have had multiple events together, and in fact, this week was going to be one of our annual climate training sessions for ministers and other faith leaders, but because of the resurgence of COVID, the other events were postponed. I want to thank the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture for hosting the event. What a thrill and an honor it is to be in this institution. And finally, I want to thank Alexis Vaughn, Janelle Jefferson, Terry Simon, and the rest of the Interfaith America staff for their hard work in organizing this event. It's been quite a while since I lived in Washington, D.C., but in some ways I certainly do feel at home here tonight because of the opportunity to speak with and be in fellowship with so many people with brilliant minds representing all different faith traditions. I have had many teachers, and some of them are here. And some of them have been introduced to me by Karenna, incidentally. I think of the Reverend Gerald Durley, who was at several of the events that Karenna and I hosted. I think of my departed friend Desmond Tutu, and my departed friend John Hope Franklin, who was such a meaningful teacher. And both Karenna and I learned from 2 brilliant African-American women who came to one of several of the Climate Underground conferences hosted on the Gore family farm each year, Leah Penniman and Karen Washington. And I think of John Lewis, with whom I had the privilege of working when I was in the Senate and he was in the House to introduce the first Environmental Justice Act, the provisions of which were later instituted in an executive order by President Clinton. In preparing my remarks for this evening, my thoughts drifted back to my time at Vanderbilt University Divinity School, where I studied after returning from service in the U.S. Army, it was one of the most valuable experiences of my life. I didn't find all the answers I was seeking, but I found better questions, and I found that faith, in whatever form it takes, can guide us to think not just of ourselves, but of life itself, of that which is larger than any one individual, to think of the beauty and wonder of all creation. And so as we face this greatest existential threat to humankind, the climate crisis, faith is certainly one of our most powerful tools in driving the solutions that we so desperately need. And that's true in part because the climate crisis is at its core a spiritual crisis. Indeed, the climate crisis is simply the most serious manifestation of an underlying collision between human civilization as we have currently organized it and the surprisingly vulnerable and fragile ecosystems of our planet. And its roots in part appear to be in the mistaken belief that we human beings are somehow separate from and superior to the rest of creation. That erroneous belief in our separateness and superiority has been the principal cause of this collision between human civilization and the ecological system of the earth. Each day provides further evidence of the spiritual arrogance that is continuing to drive this crisis, as every day we continue to spew 162 million tons of man-made global warming pollution into the very thin shell of atmosphere surrounding our planet, using it as if it's an open sewer. If you were to drive an automobile at interstate highway speed straight up in the air, you would get to the top of the troposphere, that thin blue line in the pictures the astronauts bring back. You'd get to the top of that line in about 5 to 7 minutes. It's that thin. And that's what we're using as an open sewer. And because the pollution, the heat-trapping pollution, stays in the atmosphere for long periods of time, for CO2, the most prominent of these greenhouse gas pollutants, the average is about 100 years per molecule. And thousands of years for some of the more potent molecules that are there in smaller volumes. CO2 remains by all odds the most serious. And because it accumulates, this greenhouse gas pollution traps heat that otherwise would continue to escape into the universe. And in fact, the extra amount of heat that is trapped every single day is equivalent to the heat that would be released by 600,000 first-generation atomic bombs exploding every 24 hours on Earth. It's hard to imagine that much heat and energy, but that is what we are doing every single day, and it continues to get worse. And there are consequences, of course, to these actions, and the consequences are all around us. 19 of the 20 hottest years ever measured with instruments have been since 2002, and every day watching the international television news feels like a nature hike through the book of Revelation. Yesterday, the temperature in parts of Pakistan was 123.8 degrees, well above 116 degrees in India. So hot that birds became so dehydrated they began falling out of the sky. The winter heat wheat harvest is 50% below the normal levels. And the scientists have been warning us in the IPCC of the risk of a multi-breadbasket failure. Cynthia Rosenzweig, who just won the World Food Prize, coined that phrase. And with the cutoff of exports of wheat and other important food commodities from Ukraine, the failure of crops in the upper Midwest because of the continuing millennium drought, and the depressed harvests in China because of the climate-related flooding, we are now in a multi-breadbasket failure. And in the tropics and subtropics, the combination of temperature and humidity is making larger areas literally uninhabitable. You've heard the phrase wet bulb temperature. It's a way of measuring what I've always heard on the TV weather forecasts, the heat index, the combination of heat and humidity. And because that combination is going up so quickly, billions of people are due to live in areas they've always called home, but will become areas where it is not safe to stay outside for more than a couple of hours. And ultimately, 93% of all this extra trapped heat goes into the ocean of the world. Ocean temperatures have been reaching record levels as well, and of course that fuels the stronger hurricanes and typhoons, and it disrupts the water cycle, vastly increasing the amount of water vapor going into the sky, fueling atmospheric rivers that, when they come over the land, drop rain bombs, these huge downpours that cause massive floods and mudslides. And these and other events, including sea level rise from the melting ice at the poles, is causing a rapid increase in the number of climate refugees. Indeed, before Russia's evil war against Ukraine, climate refugees outnumbered all the refugees from war and conflict around the world 4 times over. More than 10 million climate refugees just in the last few years. We also know that the impacts that are being suffered by people due to the climate crisis fall disproportionately on the most vulnerable among us in every community: the poor, the elderly, the homeless, women and children, people with mental illness, the homeless, and of course, the communities where Black people, brown people, and indigenous people are more likely to be living. The fundamental unfairness reminds me of the prophetic words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, and those words sadly describe accurately the reality of the climate crisis, as the pollution coming from one part of the planet affects people on every part of the planet. And in the United States, the climate crisis is directly tied to decades of environmental injustice at the expense of communities of color. These communities are now experiencing the effects of this crisis first and worst. Black Americans nationally have a significantly higher prevalence of heat-related mortality, and extreme heat events cause more deaths annually in the U.S. than all of the other extreme weather, climate-related events combined. Low-income neighborhoods and communities of color are far more vulnerable to these heat waves and increased temperatures, in part because of the so-called urban heat island effect. And worldwide, the co-pollution that comes from burning fossil fuels, the same combustion that creates the CO2 that traps heat, also creates particulate pollution that kills an amazing 9 million people every single year, more than COVID-19. And yet, for all of the mobilization and response to COVID-19, this invisible killer is too often ignored, in part because we have become inured to it, and in part because it disproportionately affects those who have been marginalized and discriminated against. The death rate of Black children in the United States from asthma is 10 times higher than the death rate of white children from asthma, in part because of the historically racist policies such as redlining and systemic political disempowerment and other policies that have placed communities of color closest to fossil fuel sources that spew this toxic pollution each and every day. Almost 70% of Black Americans live within 30 miles of a coal-fired power plant. Black Americans overall are 79% more likely to live in a neighborhood where pollution from fossil fuels and other industrial facilities are the greatest health threat. So there should be no doubt whatsoever that climate justice requires racial justice, and that as we strive to combat the climate crisis, we must do so in a way that brings opportunity to communities that have far too long and far too frequently been overlooked and left behind. And in searching for the solutions to the twin crises of climate and racial justice, we must work to build bridges of understanding with those who are suffering the worst impacts. Here, leaders of all faith traditions can play an incredibly important role in bringing attention to and support for these communities, and indeed they've been doing so already for decades. Because of an introduction by Karenna, I've been blessed to work with Reverend William Barber II, and we're privileged to hear from William Barber III a little bit later on. And we've worked to shine a light on environmental and climate injustices and connect the environmental and faith communities. Reverend Barber has done vital work to not only revitalize the Poor People's Campaign, but to expand upon Dr. King's initial list of 3 interlocking evils that he campaigned against 50 years ago, racism, poverty, and militarism, by adding a new focus on the 4th, and that is ecological devastation. And Will leads work in that area. Before the COVID-19 pandemic, Reverend Barber and I, along with Karenna, went on a series of visits to communities on the front lines of the climate crisis. In one trip to North Carolina, we saw the shocking negligence of polluting industries. At the site of an electricity generating plant along Belews Creek, North Carolina, there's a power plant that burns 220 rail cars worth of coal every single day on a peak day. The amount of global warming it produces is, of course, staggering, but what's left behind is toxic coal ash that was placed in an unlined pit in the ground, a vast pit. And toxic coal ash is highly poisonous with heavy metals and other poisons, and that's what's left over when coal is burned for the energy. And the pits have been unlined. The companies that produce coal ash try to keep it out of sight and out of mind. And of course, that is one of the factors that leads them to disproportionately place it in communities that have historically been deprived of the political and economic power to say, no, not here. But these communities have found ways to fight back. Indeed, the environmental justice movement was begun by an historically black community on the border between North Carolina and Virginia. In any case, in Belews Creek, they just dug a deep gash in the ground that sat directly above the water aquifer that supplies drinking water to the low-income families in that region, a disproportionate number of whom are of color, leaving the toxins from the coal ash to seep into the groundwater. And we met with the families who had suffered from illnesses that were very difficult for doctors to diagnose until the dots were connected. And it's not by mistake that this coal ash pit, like so many other toxic facilities, is located in a community with hardworking families that are struggling to make ends meet. So much of the struggle for environmental justice is rooted in economic inequality and fueled by entrenched corporate interests and the desire by fossil fuel companies to uphold the status quo. This current system that exploits people who have been deprived of the power that is justly theirs because they have historically and systemically been discriminated against is an insult and a violation of the spirit of America. And of course, the ongoing attacks on voting rights is part and parcel of this continuing effort to deprive people of the power that as American citizens they have a right to. And that's yet another reason why it is our duty as people of faith and as members of our communities to seek out these injustices and call attention to them. By linking arms with one another, we exponentially increase our ability to bring about change. And indeed, in Belews Creek, North Carolina, that change is now coming after committed and continued activism led by members of the local community. The company responsible for this pollution and the state Department of Environmental Quality finally reached an agreement to remove 80 million tons of coal ash at 6 of these completely unlined coal ash pits and ponds in the state. And while struggles like that one in Belews Creek can often take years and sometimes even decades to win, change is coming faster now than it has ever before. I saw this movement take hold in my home state of Tennessee, in southwest Memphis. A coalition led by community members from a 97% black neighborhood in southwest Memphis successfully blocked a high-pressure oil pipeline that would have been routed through their backyards directly above the freshwater aquifer that supplies 100% of the clean drinking water to the million people that live in the Memphis, Tennessee city and surrounding area. It is one of the crown jewels of the middle part of the United States, and it was being put right at risk in an earthquake zone. The companies behind the proposed pipeline, Valero and Plains All-American, admitted during an early public meeting when very few people were present, when they were asked, why did you pick that route, they said it was because they thought it was, quote, the path of least resistance. Well, they turned out to be very wrong. Justin Pearson, Kizzy Jones, and Kathy Robinson, 3 members of that community, quickly organized and founded an organization called Memphis Community Against the Pipeline, MCAP, which brought together local and national organizations, faith-based groups, and those who had never before thought of themselves as activists. I was proud to join in behind their leadership in supporting this cause and help to call out this pipeline project for what it was, a reckless, racist ripoff. And in July 2021, after an extraordinarily vigorous and effective grassroots campaign, they won, and the pipeline was officially canceled. However, there is an addendum. The residents of Southwest Memphis barely had time to celebrate before the Tennessee legislature, which is a wholly owned subsidiary of the fossil fuel industry, crafted new legislation that would prevent any other city, town, or county in the entire state of Tennessee from having any say in the placement and construction of any fossil fuel infrastructure in the state. This is what we're up against, and we have to fight against it. And in the face of ongoing and systemic attacks on environmental justice, I learned from that and other struggles that the power of faith remains essential and central. During those early days of organizing against the pipeline in Southwest Memphis, community leaders made sure that every single speech, rally, and presentation to city or county council members began with a prayer. These activists credited their faith as the driving force for their actions, and that faith continues to inspire and reinvigorate their efforts to this day, as they now are fighting against other environmental injustices in their community. And they've changed their name to Memphis Community Against Pollution. It's still MCAP. They've just broadened the focus, and they're continuing to champion the causes that matter to their neighbors, their brothers, and their sisters. That is why I want to end my remarks by talking about one of the things that fuels my faith, the ability of humanity to join together and find the solutions to our greatest challenges. I know that the realities of the climate crisis and our collective failure thus far to take the requisite actions needed to avoid the impacts that are already affecting our communities can sometimes feel overwhelming. Indeed, there are some people who go straight from climate denial to climate despair without pausing on the intermediate step of actually addressing the problem and finding the solutions. Climate anxiety is growing and is compounded particularly for Black communities as systemic racism continues to plague our society. I know all of our hearts are broken and grieving today because of the events over the weekend. And there are no words to express what I'm feeling and what I know you are feeling. We have to turn those feelings into constructive action urgently. And I know that at times those feelings can feel as if they're too much to bear. But here again, we find people lifted up by the power of faith and by hope. The greatest antidote to hopelessness is action. As John Lewis used to say, when you pray, move your feet. And the good news is, when it comes to the climate crisis and environmental racism, we have the tools we need to solve these challenges. The transition to a cleaner future can also be a transition to a more just and equitable future. Instead of building up dirty fossil fuel infrastructure that drags down communities, we can harness sources like the wind and the sun to lift them up. We must strive to ensure that these technological developments are deployed in service of a common humanity instead of being used as a tool to divide us and separate us. Given that the poorest and marginalized, which includes so many Black, brown, and indigenous peoples who've done all that is possible, we have to contribute to the solutions instead of contributing to the continuation of this crisis. This is where all of you from your different faith communities, conscientious and concerned about the climate and racial justice crisis, come in. As faith leaders and followers, you can embrace the solutions to the climate crisis and help to redefine how we view and organize our world. Through your spiritual work, you can inspire others to shift their focus and view their decisions through the lens of social and environmental justice. Faith not only gives us purpose, it unites us. No matter your faith tradition, you've made the surrendering decision to invest belief in a spiritual reality larger than any single individual, larger than each and every one of us. And we need to challenge that belief and unity to the important work of fighting the climate crisis. And that's why interfaith dialogues, like the one that Interfaith America has convened here tonight, are so important. Now more than ever, we need to harness the shared values that unite us, that encourage us to care for our neighbors, our brothers and sisters. You are here tonight to listen and learn from one another, and I am looking forward to the rest of this event. Think of what a powerful message this demonstration of collaboration and cooperation can provide to a world divided on the basis of religion, gender, race, and more. We must unite instead. So thank you for bringing your full selves to this conversation tonight and to the cause which I believe to be the most important of our lifetimes. I can attest to the fact that every ounce of energy that you pour into this effort will be justified. You will not only help serve the greater good, you are doing foundational work to deliver justice. And let me end by once again quoting Dr. King from the speech where you know the phrase, "the fierce urgency of now." He also said, "We're now faced with the fact that tomorrow is today. Now let us begin. Now let us rededicate ourselves to the long and bitter but beautiful struggle for a new world. This is the calling of the children of God, and our brothers and sisters wait eagerly for our response." I look forward to hearing and learning more from the incredible group of women and men who are gathered here and the group that Interfaith America has gathered together who are responding to that call. Thank you. Where am I going? Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice President Gore. Just from a personal point of view and perspective, I want to say that one of the highlights of my career has been to get to know first Karenna Gore and her great work through Union Theological Seminary. You'll hear from Karenna later, in the Center for Earth Ethics, and then to get to know Vice President Gore as well, and to be the recipient, all of us the recipients, of their dedication and commitment and hard work to bring the world's attention to this crisis and to have us all seek solutions and work at addressing what's threatening the very heart of our existence as humans here. So thank you, sir, and we really appreciate your willingness to come and be with us tonight. Thank you very much. So we have a program for you tonight. We're going to have a respondent to, a keynote respondent to Vice President Gore's remarks. I'll introduce that respondent, Ibrahim Abdul-Matin, in just a second, and then we'll have a panel of people who will come out and discuss the various aspects of interfaith, Black interfaith, and its intersection with addressing the issues of our current climate crisis. But our next speaker is Ibrahim Abdul-Matin. He's a senior fellow at Interfaith America. He is also the author of Green Deen, What Islam Teaches About Protecting the Climate, and he's the co-founder of Green Squash Consulting Management consulting firm based in New York that works with people, organizations, companies, coalitions, governments committed to equity and justice, and specializes in dynamic, strategic, and focused stakeholder management and partnership development. He sits on the boards of the International Living Future Institute, encouraging the creation of a regenerative built environment, and Sapelo Square, whose mission is to celebrate and analyze the experiences of Black Muslims in the United States. Ibrahim is a bright, playful spirit who authentically reflects and acts on bold questions. He is artful. His artful blending of idealism and spiritual commitment with pragmatic application has led him into government, public administration, parenthood, and media. His unique voice has helped elevate the environmental vision of Islam, the spiritual opportunity of parenting, and the cultural and political side of sports. I give you Ibrahim Abdul-Matin. Ibrahim.
Greetings, everyone. Bismillah. It's good to see everyone here. I'm happy to be present and alive and here today. Everybody say Alhamdulillah, you're alive today. So my message today is called A Message from the Ancient Future. So are you guys ready for that? And I want to begin, and I'll read the English just so it's all accessible and so I don't fall over my tongue, but you'll see why it's relevant. Musa, he said, "My Lord, expand for me my breast, or open my heart, and ease for me my task. Make easy my task, and untie or unloosen the knot from my tongue, that they may understand my speech." I would like to start my comments today acknowledging that despite how people may or may not present themselves, we generally know almost nothing about one another. This can be expressed in the ways that some people in the world have gotten ahead, and some people that are elevated, others that look like them or remind them of themselves. This means that a lot of folks that do not share their gender or their skin color or their cultural background are then left on the outside looking in of an opportunity that they may be able to thrive in. We may see each other all the time, every single day. We may see each other walking down the street or walking in the hallway. We may work side by side with people. We might be best friends with someone, but do we really know what they're going through? I submit in this very human moment in a very human way that everything is not always what it seems. Some of us are sitting here with our hearts wide open as the Mississippi is long. Our willingness to give out of our own selves and our own time can fill the space of the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. We have reservoirs of nostalgia or our anxiety. We have reservoirs of strength that have allowed us to be present even in moments when our sense of nostalgia or our anxiety would normally shift our gaze to some idyllic past or future. And yet, if you looked at us, We might have what looks like a scowl. Some people might dismiss our inner beauty because all that you see to them, all they see on the outside is a mug, a mean face. That's a lot of New Yorkers. Or a lot of people from Boston, more from the Boston side. People that look rude, but they really are so sweet. So I invite you to look past the grit or the etched lines of sorrow that may line those faces. Similarly, there are some people whose hearts are broken. And this reminds me of the famous Paul Laurence Dunbar poem, "We wear the mask that grins and lies. It hides our cheeks and shades our eyes. This debt we pay to human guile, with torn and bleeding hearts we smile. And mouthed with myriad subtleties, why should the world be overwise in counting all our tears and sighs? Nay, let them see us while we wear the mask. We smile, but oh, great Christ, our cries to thee from tortured souls arise. We sing, but oh, the clay is vile beneath our feet. And long the mile, but let the world dream otherwise. We wear the mask." Some of us have hidden diagnoses with terrifying prognoses. Some of us have been hurt and battered and abused, and not a soul in the world knows. Some of us have been the ones that have hurt others and have battered others and abused others, and no one knows, and you now sit in that personal grief and sorrow. Only God the Almighty can judge or absolve us of these sins. So let us begin today not as one sitting in judgment. You are not better than another person here. No one is. In my tradition in Islam, we know that one's wealth or possessions or accumulation of things is not what gives us any value. You are more than what you can make or create or destroy. Your soul is what makes you special. The intrinsic nature of your being, the fact that you exist, that is what makes you special. We start today acknowledging that as we sit here, all the things in the known universe, every action that has ever happened, everything that has happened from the beginning of time to now, the smallest quark to the largest quasar, has occurred for this moment to happen right here and right now. And if we gently look around the room, you can do that, it's okay. Gently look around the room, make eye contact with somebody you don't know. That every single one of us was brought here in this particular room through all of history, through all of time, for this moment to happen right now. So I just want to also extend my blessings to all the people in the room, and that also to the team at Interfaith America. My mom and dad are here, so give them snaps or a round of applause. I also just want to be clear about some things, just because this, sometimes you're not. People make assumptions. So I'm Muslim, and what do we believe? We believe most fundamentally in the oneness of God. In Green Dean, in my book, I talk about the idea of Tawheed, which is we acknowledge the oneness of God in His creation. So that if you're standing on the top of a mountain, which many of you have done, or you're standing at the edge of a great sea, and you're filled with a great sigh, wow, and you think, look what God has created. You're actually acknowledging, look what I am connected to. Look what I am a part of. Because you like that sunset, you like that mountaintop, you like that meadow, like those rolling hills in upstate New York, you are created. We believe in the angels of God. And in Islam, we believe that angels are pure and spiritually obedient beings created by God to fulfill His commands. We believe in the revelation in the books of God. Muslim believes in the revelation sent by God to His prophets, including the Quran, the Torah, the Gospel, the scrolls of Abraham, and of course, my Aunt Dell's favorite, who lived out here in Scottsburg, Virginia, the Psalms of David. We believe in the prophets of God, all of the messengers of God, such as Noah, Moses, Solomon, Jesus, even the ones that we don't know that about, the ones whose stories are not written. We believe in the day of judgment. We believe that in the appointed day of judgment, and we believe in heaven and hell. And unlike some of your faiths, we don't know if we're going to go or not. So every day we don't know what's going on. We believe in resurrection after death, and that we will be called to account for what we did. So I say this to you because I want to be clear about my cosmology. And by cosmology, I mean how I understand the science of the origin and the development of the universe. And there's one other thing I want to be very clear about. The creator of the universe created both the seen and the unseen world. Among God's creations in the unseen world are the angels and what we call the jinn. The jinn are supernatural creatures that exist in a world parallel to our own. Almost every culture boasts stories and legends of unseen creatures. Without diverging too much into this conversation, in Islam, jinn can be both good and evil. We have different words and names for these entities in all of our traditions, but I want to say very clearly, so that all the beings are present can understand and know that if there are demons and evil spirits in this room and in this space, leave. I tell you to leave. Your whisperings, your enmity, your doubt, your lies, your hearsay, all of that negative energy is not welcome here. So what do I mean when I say a message from the ancient future? In Jeremiah 6:16, it says, stand at the crossroads and look. Ask for the ancient paths. Ask where the good way is and walk in it, and you will find rest for your souls. When we talk about walking, we're not talking about like, I'm a pedestrian walking, right? We're talking about that's the path. You walk in that path. That's the way. In Islam, we say deen. Deen is the path or the way of life. This is your deen. In this context, I want to bring us to this point of a crossroads. There have always been crossroads in our context, in our existence. There was a crossroads when the European invaders came to Africa and whispered into the ears of tribal leaders. At that crossroads, those tribal leaders could have said, no, we are not listening to you. We will not fight the neighboring tribe, even if we don't share a religion with them, even if we don't share a language with them. We will not fight them and sell our captives into slavery. But we made a different choice. Sadly, most of us were put into slavery because of the greed and of the malice and the negative thoughts and those negative ideas. There was a crossroads here, later, on this soil, when some chose to rebel, and mostly they died, when they fought back and they fought hard, but they didn't win. There was a crossroads when people like Black Moses, when she called to many of them and said, let's go. She said, let's go, we're going now. And some of them said, no, I'm staying. Some of them went. And some of them in my family went all the way up to Canada. Before the Civil War, they established an entire community. Apparently, they built some amazing furniture. It'd be amazing if I could imagine rocking in one of those rocking chairs. There was a crossroads for freed men and women like George Washington Carver, who I acknowledge as one of the godfathers of the environmental justice movement. Became the best in the world in taking the knowledge of the natural world and understanding how to use the scientific method to become legends of science and environmental stewardship. Put Black and brown people at the center of deciding how the natural world around them should be used in a way that does not hurt, maim, kill, or destroy. He is the godfather of how to use science to the best of our ability. Instead of using science to make weapons, using science to understand the most, because science at that level is literally a form of worship. We're at a crossroads now, and we always like to think about what is the state of Black America? What is the state of our people? And oftentimes when we want to ask that question, what is the state of our people, we get into statistics. And sadly, if you go back 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, the statistics are still the same. It's depressing. If you are a Black male, I'm 45. If you're my age, it is depressing. I grew up in the crack era where there were bullets. There were literally bullets flying around. We were protected. Our parents took care of us. But around us, it was dangerous. But it feels like that again. So why do we keep in this cycle? One indicator, though, that I want to call our attention to, the Urban League talks about the attack on voting rights. And to connect that to the climate crisis, why do you think Black and brown people are not as consistent voters, because the climate crisis is pushing people out of their homes, forcing people into migration that they don't necessarily want to do. It's much easier to vote when you've been voting at the same polling place for the past 30 years. But if you have to consistently change where you're voting and you have to go move to another city or move to another place, the last thing on your list is, I'm going to go sign up to vote. The more we have this climate crisis, the more voting rights are going to be under attack. And the more people are going to be disenfranchised. I also want to bring us to a point, I think, in terms of our folks, people, black folks, one great indicator of us right now, as always, is culture. One way that we understand, right, where are we at is in terms of culture. Now, some of you in this room have listened to the new Kendrick Lamar album. Okay, some of you, okay. Some of you have also listened to the new Black Star album. I just want to see. No, not as many. Some people have. Okay, that's what's up. So I want to lean in there for a second, but I'll just take a real quick detour. The very beginnings of hip hop, when in the rubble of the Bronx, in the rubble of New York City, when the Bronx was burning, what did we do? We were at a crossroads. We made art. We painted on the walls. We danced to resolve disputes. We used all sorts of machinery and made amazing sounds. We made a decision in that moment. We chose an ancient path. We created something beautiful out of nothing. Right? At the same time, and Vice President Gore referenced this, at the same time in North Carolina, there were a group of black church women in Warren County, North Carolina, who laid their bodies on a road before the dump trucks carrying soil contaminated with highly toxic PCBs to block their progress. That was the beginning of the modern environmental justice movement. At the same time we were birthing hip hop, we're also birthing the EJ movement. Right? Later on, as hip hop was reaching its golden age, in 1987, the United Church of Christ Commission of Racial Justice issued its groundbreaking report on race and toxic waste in the United States. They framed environmental racism. People had never thought about it in that way before. So at every moment that we've been transforming and our relationship to the planet, and our relationship to the earth, we make beautiful art and beautiful music and beautiful culture. That's how we operate. So what's the state of our music right now and our vibe right now? I want to just bring, really quick, I'll bring it back to Kendrick Lamar's album. And if there's a thesis of his album is, don't tap dance around the difficult conversations. He has some real tough conversations in that album. He meets us where we're at. And right now, so I don't tap dance around it, the number one contributor to climate change on the planet Earth today is the United States Department of Defense. We can't tap dance around that. People of faith have to call that out. We have to confront that and say, why is that the case? If we are truly united as people of faith and black interfaith, we are an integral part of the military in this country. Every single person in here has a family member that's in the military or is in the military. And what that tells me is an opportunity for those folks to lead when they come out of the military, of building a world that doesn't need the military, particularly our folks that are connected to faith. So we can't tap that dance around that. The question is, at this crossroads, what decision are we going to make? And if you're listening to the Black Star album, Mostef Yassine Bey says, God gave us the design and we assembled the ark. It was water then, but it will be fire next time. Moses went to the top of the mountain, and what did he do? He talked to the burning bush. The bush was burning, but it was the voice of God. But now the whole earth is burning. Are we paying attention? Are we listening to what the earth is saying? Are we listening to the sound? And are we paying attention deeply in our hearts? There's a couple things I want to end with. I always talk, when I talk to, we all come from different traditions. I was recently reading Bryant Terry's book. It was about black food. It's a black food book, and it talks about all different types of black food. And I was a little offended that there wasn't a bean pie in there. I was like, how are you going to have a book about black food and have no bean pie? There wasn't anything about fried fish in there. I was like, there wasn't anything about fried fish. It doesn't make any sense. So I was like, all right, but I'm not going to be mad at you, Brian. He's my boy. I got you. We can have a conversation about this later on. Maybe I should make him some bean pie. But the thread that I just really want to hammer in is just the next part of when Moses was speaking with God, when God told Moses to go to Pharaoh. And we have consistently, as black Americans and people of faith, we have been asked to go to Pharaoh time and time again. We've been in the house of Pharaoh. We've literally helped build this house, just like Moses helped build the house of Pharaoh. And time again, we are forced to go and speak truth to that power and hold it accountable. It is exhausting. For some of the elders in this room, you've been doing this for 30 and 40 and 50 years. God bless you. We are constantly having to do this. And what we see right now are young people that are refusing to participate. So we have work to do as people of faith. There's checking out of the conversation. We have to pull them back in and make sure that they are equipped to speak to pharaohs. Just like Harriet Tubman spoke to pharaohs and spoke truth to that power. Not only did she drag people out of slavery, she went with armed guards, with members of the 54th Regiment down into South Carolina and liberated people directly out of slave plantations. Are we ready to do this? Are we ready to speak to pharaohs? Are we ready to stand up and speak that truth to power? And the only way we're going to be ready is if we're not divided and conquered. Because like I said in the very beginning, the only way they could come into Africa and take us out of that situation, the only way Taki's rebellion in Jamaica could get destroyed and defeated, was when we were divided and conquered. Our unity is our strength. So the next thing that Moses says is, grant me a helper for my family. Aaron, Harun, we say in Arabic, my brother. Strengthen me through him and let him share my task. So I'm asking every single black person, every single person of color, every single person in this room, every single person that's listening to this live stream, this is a message from the ancient future. This is a message when we are at this crossroads. We're looking into the past and seeing those roads that we could have taken, and we're going to remember those roads, and we are at this moment again where we can make the right decision. We can just say no to the whisperings. We can tell the evil spirits to get out of this room. We can say, this is my brother. This is my sister. You might be Buddhist. You might be Ifa and Candomblé. You might be Christian. You might not have a faith, but we are united, and we must be united if we're going to figure this out. If we are going to go to Pharaoh, we must bring back this message from the ancient future. We must see the future that's in front of us, a place where we're going to be shocked that people used to use water for toilets. They're like, what was that? Y'all use clean water to put your waste in? Right? They're going to be shocked that people were hungry. People didn't have homes. You let people go without love? No, that doesn't make sense. This is a message from the future, from the ancient future. We have these paths that have been laid for us. Let's walk in those paths. Let's follow the deen. If you are any faith, the faith that you're in, practice your faith. Don't tell anybody what to do with theirs. Get into your groove. Follow your traditions. Follow your path. Let yourself go where the truth leads you. I hope that it made sense today. Did I make sense? Yes. Okay, just checking in. Someone recently told me there's an analogy that climate change has to cancer, right? Cancer is like inflammation, it causes tumors, and there's an analogy that has on the earth as well. And someone told me, there's this language of we want to beat cancer. Everybody wants to beat it. And she said that's not the approach she took. She said her prayer was to ask God what can I learn from this without it killing me? And how can I learn the lesson of this unleashing of this wildness of this cancer and learn how to push it back down and at the same time grow and be better? So we have a beautiful challenge in front of us, an existential challenge in front of us. God willing, we're up to the task. Anything that I've said that's been useful or beneficial, it comes from the creator of the universe. Anything I've said that is wrong or inappropriate, please take that up with me directly. That comes from me, so please forgive me. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Alexis Vaughn, and I am the Director of Racial Equity Initiatives at Interfaith America. I'm excited to introduce our panelists who will lead us in the next part of our conversation tonight. We welcome back to the stage one of our keynote speakers and Black Interfaith Fellows, Ibrahim Abdul-Matin. And we also welcome William J. Barber III, who is Director of Climate and Environmental Justice at the Climate Reality Project. William grew up in Eastern North Carolina, where under the tutelage of his father, Bishop William J. Barber II, and his mother, Rebecca Barber, he developed a deep commitment to racial and social justice and environmental stewardship at an early age. He now works as an environmental and climate justice scholar and advocate with nearly a decade of social justice organizing experience and deep academic training in law and the sciences. He's interested in the renewable energy field and clean economy, specifically in initiatives that are being taken to promote opportunity for low-income communities and communities of color. We welcome Crystal Cavalier, who is the co-founder of 7 Directions of Service, an organization which seeks to mobilize and advocate for Indigenous and historically marginalized communities who bear the brunt of social and environmental injustices. Crystal is a citizen of the Occaneechi Band of the Saponi Nation in Burlington, North Carolina, and she is also an expert in her field of strategic intelligence, political campaigns, and public administration. Crystal currently consults on political and tribal campaigns from elections to protecting sacred spaces. And she is currently a doctoral student at the University of Dayton and working on her dissertation on the social justice of missing, murdered Indigenous women and gas oil pipelines in frontline communities. We welcome Karenna Gore, who is the founder and executive director of the Center for Earth Ethics at Union Theological Seminary in New York. Karenna formed the Center for Earth Ethics in 2015 to address the moral and spiritual dimensions of the climate crisis. Working at the intersection of faith, ethics, and ecology, she guides the center's programs, educational initiatives, and movement building. Karenna is also an author, lawyer, and dedicated climate activist. And finally, we welcome Pamela Yetunde, who is a community Dharma leader, pastoral counselor, and the author of the award-winning book, Buddhist-Christian Dialogue, U.S. Law, and Womanist Theology for Transgender Spiritual Care. She is the co-editor of the anthology Black and Buddhist. Her next book, Casting Indra's Net, is a book about interreligious appreciation and civility as public spiritual care. Welcome to all of you. So I'd like to begin this conversation talking about our spiritualities. As we've heard already tonight, all of our lives have been shaped by religion's impact on public life in one way or another, but we don't always talk about how our faith influences our sense of relationship and responsibility to creation. I know that some traditions emphasize humankind's dominion over creation as if the earth is just a resource for us to use to sustain human life, which is why we should care about it. So this first question is to you, Crystal, and to you, Io. How do your faith traditions help you think about your relationship to the earth and your responsibility to care for creation?
Okay. Mikuramin Chin Kyohe, Nahon Pipise, Mima Crystal, Mima Okanichi Saponi, Mima Mebin, North Carolina, Watiwa. So what I did was I just gave you guys a traditional Tudelo greeting, and I just said, hello, my name is Crystal, citizen of the Okanichi Band of the Saponi Nation from Mebane, North Carolina, and you're welcome here. And the reason I do that is because our languages contain our spiritual values, and it's how we're all connected. We believe that we're connected to everything in relationality. We're connected to the land, the water, the animals, the air, everything. And that is how that's how we care for things. It's in our creation stories. It is how we relate to people. It's how we relate to human beings and how we can relate to each other. And those are some ways that we've done. So like literally, we say grandmother earth, grandfather mountain, auntie moon, brother sun, old man river. And like earlier, we were talking about how we have to work together in unison and unity. So I'll give you an example. When we were organizing the Mountain Valley Pipeline Southgate Extension Water Walk, we took a 7-week campaign and we took everybody from all walks of life, all interfaiths, and we planned for this because we were fighting against this fossil fuel that was coming through our community. And we had to get people enrolled and we had to get people involved. And when we started out, we all started out with an interfaith prayer because we believe that everybody prays to whoever you want to pray to or whatever. But if we do it in unison, we can just be better. And then once people feel comfortable and trust each other, it is a lot easier to organize in our communities, especially when it comes around the earth, environmental degradations, and how we all have to stand up and fight back. So thank you.
Yeah. First of all, I just want to say thank you for the invitation. Thank you all for being here. And I grew up in the United Methodist Church. In our theology, if you will, I grew up to believe that the earth would be destroyed by God and all of its inhabitants except for a select few. So I've always grown up with a belief that the earth would be destroyed. Not that we would be the ones destroying it, however. And so that's another conversation. But fast forward, I was 23, just out of college, and I was in Zimbabwe, and there was a woman who was building a school, and she was so excited to show the Americans there her new school. And the reason why she was excited about this is because they had replaced the grass with tin that they had purchased from the United States. And so we went into the school and looked up and could see some particles that were exposed. And we asked her if that was asbestos. And she said she didn't know, she had never heard of it, but she was so proud that she bought it from the United States. And she said, if it is, don't tell anybody. And that was my wake-up call. I was very naive about a lot of things, but that was my wake-up call to say, oh my God, this is what we do. We sell poisonous materials to African countries. We profit from that. So about a year after that, I entered an organization called the Brethren Volunteer Service, which is like the Peace Corps, but part of the Church of the Brethren. And before I knew it, I was working in an ecumenical, which I knew nothing about, ecumenical nuclear disarmament, which I knew nothing about, organization, which looking back on that tells me, oh, at a young age, I was already doing some interfaith work that was environmental justice. But I didn't know it at the time. Maybe those words didn't even exist then. So fast forward, about 15 years later, I have an encounter with a book written by Thich Nhat Hanh called Touching Peace. And in this book, which I wasn't looking for Buddhism, but in this book there's a very brief meditation that I'll share with you that was the beginning of me thinking of myself differently on this planet. I won't take you through the meditation itself. I'll just read it to you. Basically, that breathing in and breathing out, the meditator begins to see themselves as a flower. Imagine yourself as a flower, feeling fresh. Then seeing yourself as a mountain and feeling solid. Seeing yourself as still water, and then reflecting all that is. Seeing yourself as space and feeling free. And that was the beginning of my Buddhist practice. And I'll just say in closing, at this moment, that I consider myself to be an interfaith pan-Buddhist. In other words, I still carry the Christian ethics that I inherited from my United Methodist family and have incorporated a variety of belief systems throughout my life and remain grounded in Buddhism.
Beautiful. I want to draw us back now to something that was alluded to in both keynotes, which is this unique moment that we're in. It's a moment of greater attention being given to Black leadership and Black-centered storytelling, perhaps inspired by the 1619 Project, centering Black perspectives in the telling of American history. And one thing that uncovered is just how deeply intersectional and diverse Black life is. For example, some folks might assume that Black people of faith are new to interfaith cooperation, but we've been out here, right? Interfaith is who we've been all along as a people of diaspora and largely disenfranchised all over the world. So with that, I'd like to ask you, William, where have you seen Black communities of faith working in diverse coalitions to address the climate crisis, and what's the significance of that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Thank you, for that. I think historically, when you look at the involvement of the Black church, the Black faith community in the rise of the environmental justice movement, there's a depth of influence of the faith community that is oftentimes not explicitly discussed. Some of it was alluded to already in the 1982 Warren County protests, largely hailed as the epicentral launch of the United States environmental justice movement. A number of key leaders who happen to be leaders of faith there. Reverend Dr. Ben Chavis, who was a minister in the United Church of Christ, was one of the key figureheads of that interracial coalition protesting the dumping of this toxic waste. He actually coined the term environmental racism. You go a few years earlier, you look at 1968, lesser known, you see the involvement of Reverend Dr. King in the Memphis sanitation strike, which was one of the earliest acts of African Americans en masse on an issue of environmental concern. You go down the list, James Farmer Jr., the founder of the Congress for Racial Equality, who grew up in the Methodist Church and whose father was a prominent theologian, stated in the height of the civil rights movement that whatever we do in civil rights would be of no meaning if we did not save the environment, because we would all have the equality of extinction. Mm-hmm. Drawing these connections. And it makes sense, right? Because the presence of the Black faith community in the inaugural stages of the environmental justice movement make us realize that faith traditions had and continue to be some of our greatest bastions of activism, and not frameworks. Not only that, but their engagement literally laid the foundation and the skeletal framework for the activism around climate justice we see today. And so when we think about this present climate crisis, a quote comes to mind: the green economy should not just be about reclaiming throwaway stuff. It should be about reclaiming thrown away communities. It should not just be about recycling things to give them a second life. We should also be gathering up people and giving them a second chance. In other words, we should use the transition to a better energy strategy as an opportunity to create a better economy and a better country all around the world. That's from Van Jones. And when you actually dive into the history of redlining, I wish we had time to do it today, and understand how communities of color, communities on the front lines they don't just happen to be victims, they were victimized by bad policy decision, which means as we are trying to redress the climate crisis, we have to make good policy decisions, that we really have to take that into account. And I'll close here. I know we're talking about faith, but I fully subscribe, Imam, to the belief that where your treasure, there your heart will be. And when we think about the green transition, the current and future transition to the clean energy economy, talking about addressing the climate crisis, represents the emergence of a multi-trillion-dollar market on the scale of 50 to $131 trillion. Comparatively, the entire Internet of Things was valued at only $8.9 trillion in 2020. Now, what is the connection I'm making? When you think about how historically communities on the front lines of the now climate crisis have been locked into existences of poverty, if we are looking at that amount of investment going into the clean transition, sitting on a scale of multiple times the entire market for the Internet of Things, and we are only talking about frontline communities, communities of color participating as a part of the workforce and not ownership, then we are actually replicating a type of climate discrimination in of itself. So.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and it's a perfect segue to my last question for all of you, specifically to Karenna and Ibrahim, but if perhaps all of you want to offer a short word on this, we'd love to hear your thoughts. But I appreciate both Vice President Gore and you, Ibrahim, for acknowledging the fact that, you know, even though we're all enjoying this lovely evening and we're happy to be here, we're also bringing complex feelings of grief and anger and sadness into this space as a result of the recent massacre in Buffalo. And with that on our minds, you know, it ought to be a reminder that we can no longer remain silent about the threats white supremacy poses to all of us, including the planet. So I'd like to ask you, maybe Karenna, then Ibrahim, then anyone else who'd like to speak, how should faith leaders respond to this moment when climate change is compounding so many other social crises, namely migration from the global south, displacement within this country, growing economic disparities, increased political polarization, all of that. What do you see as the role of faith leaders and interfaith coalitions in this moment?
Thank you so much, Alexis. I want to begin by saying how honored I am to be here and how grateful I am to Interfaith America, and how grateful I am to Fred Davie and Union Theological Seminary for providing me with an education that has opened a pathway to do this work that gives me the great blessing to be here in community with you all. In feeling the things that you've just brought to the fore and the perilous nature of the climate emergency, when you think about what has power that can be an appropriate counterforce, I can think of no two greater things than the power of faith and the power of African American history and culture. And so being here in this moment makes me feel some hope about the movement that we're weaving and building together. In this museum, there's a marker for James Cone, who was a professor of mine at Union. And he is known for Black liberation theology. I was able to learn from him in a systematic theology class in which he taught different liberation theologies, different approaches, and one of the things that he brought was Vine Deloria, Native American theologian, and it opened up an entire path of recognition of the root causes, not only the interconnected root causes of ecological destruction and the dehumanization of people of African descent and of Native descent. And not to go on too long about that, but just to say that I think the role of people of faith is to look not only at the level of effect. We have to look at the level of effect. As you mentioned, there'll be refugees coming, there's people migration coming, we have to deal with adaptation, we have to draw from our faith traditions and teachings to say, welcome the stranger, to say, awaken to the illusion of separation between you and the other. You know, what you do to the least of these, you do to me. We have to awaken people's hearts to deal with those elements of adaptation. But we can't just act at the level of effect, we need to be at the level of cause. I think faith communities can look at that root level of cause where that's joined and heal. it. And also, there are three roles that faith communities can play: pastoral, prophetic, and practical. To start with, actually, I'll start with prophetic, which is telling the truth. And that's true more than ever today. Pastoral, obviously, we're dealing with many emotions, including denial, which a lot of people use to block the grief and the pain. We need pastoral care for that. And taking people through extreme weather events and the things that are coming, communities. And then practical, so things like greening houses of worship and dealing with finances, organizing, and so on. So these are roles that faith communities can play. I also just want to say, to wrap up my part, that on that level of dealing the level of cause, we still have the single biggest cause of the climate crisis, the burning of fossil fuels. That, as we've heard several times today, affects people's health and disproportionately affects the health of Black communities. And you have communities like MCAP in Memphis. You have people like Crystal and William who've been fighting Mountain Valley Pipeline, another fossil fuel pipeline. We have people on the front lines doing this work, and they're doing it not just on behalf of those communities, but the whole health of the planet. They need more help, more support. So building this movement here is where I think the biggest energy and hope lies.
Thank you. I thank you for bringing up Dr. Cohn, because he's wrote a seminal essay, Whose Earth Is It Anyway? And in that essay, which was 20 years ago now or even more, he really just like outlines the reality of the impact of white supremacy, and he names it and calls it out in a way that hasn't been done since then, really. A couple of things I want to draw attention to your point, was compared to the $6.4 trillion spent on war in the past 2 decades, the cost of shifting the US power grid to 100% renewable over the next 10 years is an estimated $4.5 trillion. So we could have already done this if that was our focus and that was our intention and that was our will. There are 800 US military bases in 90 countries. We don't need that many. The next country has maybe 5 out of their own country. So these are policy decisions that I feel like the faith community has to weigh in very heavily on. Instead of giving our policymakers a carte blanche because they support America for some patriotic impulse, the patriotic impulse should be to rein in that sort of like aggressive impulse and say, we can do better than this. There's a better way to do that. I think that's a really strong role. I think the other space is that there's evidence of, there's a farm, and actually in Rensselaer County, led by a woman, Leah Pennyman, where her focus is on healing scarred earth, returning the soil to pre-colonial levels, to really getting into the dirt. And I truly think that the faith community and faith communities should lead where young people aren't just taught to go to another country and teach them about their religion. They should go in our country because we have some of the last arable land on the planet Earth, and they should get their hands in the dirt, like the project your family's working on, the project a lot of other people's families are working on, where they're doing land trusts and really going back to the land and trying to figure that out. And then there's like really tough decisions that people have to make. The folks in this room who have children are struggling and wrestling with the same thing that I'm wrestling with. Where do we send our kids to school? Like legit, where do we send them to school where they're gonna be safe? Where they're not gonna have to worry about getting shot by random people? We've made dramatic, huge life-changing decisions in my own family just to make sure our kids are in an environment where they're safe. They don't understand the gravity of that. But we need to create spaces outside of some of the other school systems and create spaces that are affordable for folks, that are safe, that they can learn some basic values, some ethics, and some principles. And then the last idea I want to say is that the imagination of people of faith and of the faith leaders, we always talk about the zombie narrative, right? Like, you know, people in Hurricane Katrina were getting shot at, Black people were getting shot at when they were going across the bridge, when they were trying to get to safety. People are shooting at them, right? We need to transform our narrative to say, what can we do? Maybe not everybody gets to come in your house if you live across that bridge. That's fair. But what can we do along the way to support people? The idea that I want you to leave with in your head is, what is the safe passage around the mountain? Right? There was always a story of a tough passage, a tough way to go, a fight. You go through the middle of the mountain. It's snowy, it's jagged, it's difficult. But there was always a safe passage. All of our traditions have a way that you greet the stranger. You welcome, like Eboo said in the beginning, you welcome the migrant as a pilgrim. Every single one of our traditions has that. And that is something I think we need to get back to.
May I? Yes. Brother Ibrahim, I would like to add a little neo-soul and some R&B to your list of resources.
I would love to hear that.
Okay, here too. India Ari, who is like, I mean, her spirituality is so integrated. And there's a song called Nature, which is very Taoist. And I think it's very inspirational. And because she is inspired by Stevie Wonder, I would like for us to revisit his album, which I think was panned in its day, Journey Through the Secret Life of Plants. You remember it?
Some people know it.
Yeah, so add that. And then also I want to say this about feeling and decentering human beings in this. The meditation that I read to you was like an invitation for me to decenter myself as a human being and center other aspects in nature and to be able to feel their resonance, their vibration. Whatever we can do to deepen our empathy towards other life forms is something that we need to do. And then lastly, I want to say this. My mother brought me up to embrace so many taboos. It's amazing that I ever had a conversation of any importance. And one of those taboos was religion. You're never to talk about religion, right? But we need to talk across our religious traditions, especially with the rise of Christian nationalism, which has a destructive impact on much of life and our planet. We need to be able to have respectful conversations about these things with people who are different than we are in our views.
I just want to add with that, in the American Indian traditions of spirituality, people have to understand what we went through and how we formed solidarities with our enslaved Africans and how our cultures intermarried and how most of that history goes together. And people don't understand that history. Like Will, like he's finally embracing his Tuscarora heritage. And I mean, it's a lot of stories that are like that, but that's the only way we're going to be able to bring this unity and understanding. People have to understand the history that's not told, and you have to go out and find it. So yeah, thank you.
And I'll just, chime in and say, just remembering how our faith institutions have always been bastions of activism, and that our faith traditions have never been schizophrenic. They have always spoke to both the personal, but also the practical, the physical, what we are experiencing outside of our persons. And when we know that because our faith traditions have been political, have been bastions of political activism, recognizing that they can move policy. And so understanding the history of how we got into these situations, using faith institutes as educational centers, but also as engines to actually move policy for our people is so crucial. And I would just add a resource to the litany of musical resources that The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. When you really want to understand why redlining has had such a detrimental economic impact, and then you connect it to where we are with the climate crisis, the vulnerability of the climate crisis, that's an incredible place to start.
Alexis, can I make one quick point really quickly?
All right, closing word.
Just the notion of science and the relationship of faith and science. I think I was listening to a program once, and it was a Native American spiritual leader, and it said, science needs ceremony. You can't have science without the ceremony. And if you do that, if you have it without ceremony, it creates destructive tools. So just to add that to the conversation.
Thank you.
Snotty nose res kids, add that to your list.
What's that?
Snotty nose res kids.
Snotty nose res.
Good music.
Well, thank you so much for this conversation. We appreciate all of you so much. Thank you.
Are you done?
Well, we have a lot to do, y'all. Not only being better climate activists, but we need to tell our stories with honesty and integrity. And we also need to celebrate the interfaith bridge building that we're doing and the important work that our communities are already up to. So now I would like to invite Vice President Al Gore back up to the podium to lead us out with a charge, move us from hopelessness to action, from conversation to action, and offer us some closing words. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. What a wonderful panel. I thought that was just fantastic. And I learned so much. I hope Karenna will forgive me for telling a story from when she was a little girl. We lived on a farm about 50 miles east of Nashville, and I commuted to work. And we decided to get a puppy. And one of the women that I worked with in Nashville had a sideline training dogs. And so here was a new puppy, and would you give us some tips? And she drove out to the farm, and she said, well, first I've got to ask you some questions. What's this puppy going to do? So it's going to be a puppy. Going to be a dog. Well, no. Is it going to be a guard dog? Is it going to be a bird dog? Is it going to be a hunting dog? Is it going to be a retriever? And then she said something that has stuck with me. She said, a puppy has to have a purpose. And I thought, well, if puppies have to have a purpose, I guess we do too. And I had an education with some of the greatest institutions our country has, including Vanderbilt Divinity School, which I mentioned earlier, and never in any part of my education did I hear the answer to the question, what is the purpose of life? We went to a little church called New Salem Missionary Baptist Church in Elmwood, Tennessee, a few miles from the farm. And one Sunday morning in adult Sunday school, a truck driver who taught that class on Sundays gave me the answer. The purpose of life, he said, is to glorify God. The purpose of life is to live our lives in a way that glorifies the Creator of all life. If that is our purpose, and I believe it is, how can we serve that purpose while heaping utter contempt on creation? How can we glorify the Creator by actively participating in the destruction of this beautiful earth? Well, the answer is, of course, we cannot. We must instead protect it. The Native Americans who protested one of the pipelines coming with the tar sands from Canada rejected the title protesters and adopted the name protectors. And they taught water is life. It was water that was threatened. But in this challenge, we can find our purpose, and we can find hope that lifts us up and fills our hearts. A young Native American woman introduced to me by Karenna, Lila June, a Dene woman, often called Navajo, just as the Haudenosaunee are often called the Iroquois. She told the story of the history of her people. And while we sometimes think of Native American societies as being peaceful and in harmony, they were for a time, but they came into a period in which men succumbed to the temptations of arrogance and power and evil, and they themselves turned to enslavement and abuse. And a drought in the Southwest, in an area now known as Chaco Canyon, forced them out of their community. And in that crucible, they reorganized their lives and adopted what we would call democracy, collective reasoning, and intelligence. And I recall that story listening to this panel because we are in such a moment. We can still avoid the worst of the consequences of the climate crisis. We have it within our power. We often focus on the destructive nature of the consequences now befalling us. But we also should concentrate on the emergence, nearly at miraculous speed, of solutions to the climate crisis. They are available to us right now. And this is not a Pollyannish overstatement. The International Energy Agency and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change both have told us that in order to cut the emissions of these heat-trapping gases that are destroying our future at present, in order to cut them in half by 2030, just 8 years from now, we have everything we need with proven deployment models. And by the way, this is not just an overly hopeful prediction. Last year, calendar year 2021, if you look at all of the new electricity generation installed in every country all around the world, what percentage of it do you think was solar and wind rather than fossil? The answer is 90% of all of the new electricity generation being installed now is solar and wind because it's cheaper. And you don't have to buy the fuel. The sun and the wind are freely available, sent to us by our Creator, sent to us by the natural ecosystem of this earth. We now see the projections that within 2 years, every model of car will be cheaper in the electric version than in the internal combustion version. We see the movement, the farmer-led movement toward regenerative agriculture, which can put CO2 back into the soils. When I was a boy, my father taught me how to recognize the richest and most fertile soil, and it was black and moist. And I'm embarrassed to tell you, it took me 50 years before I understood and learned why it was black. That's the carbon, literally. And it's moist because the carbon feeds the natural life forms rich in the soil that makes it capable of holding the water and the nutrition. We know how to solve the climate crisis, but we need the political will. Now we see the discussion of all these alternatives. Just today, a new coalition was announced by representatives from Harvard University and the Rockefeller Foundation and several other institutions and distinguished individuals who ought to have better sense, saying it's time to talk about geoengineering. What does that mean? It means putting chemicals in the sky. They've backed off a bit and say we're going to put chalk dust in the sky surrounding the earth to block out the sunlight so that we won't get so much heat coming in. Turns out solar panels need the sunlight. Turns out plants need the sunlight. Why would they propose that? Because it is another way of surrendering to the assumption that there's no way we can stop burning coal and oil and gas. We can't even think about stopping the fossil fuels. because the fossil fuel industries have captured and attained control over the policymaking processes in key countries, including our own. We can't even talk about that. Now here is they are also talking about investing enormous sums of money in brand new giant machines that will suck the CO2 out of the atmosphere. Now, cooler heads that can add numbers on a sheet of paper will say, well, you know, the expense of that is just unbelievably high. But again, why are we talking about massive and expensive plans to suck the CO2 out of the atmosphere? Because again, we are somehow not allowed to talk realistically with hope in our hearts about the process of stopping to put it up there in the first place. Most of it comes from burning fossil fuels. You know the first law of holes. When you're in a hole, stop digging the hole. Now here's the other thing, and this is connected to the final words I want to give you, and these are words of real hope. Let's suppose for a moment that it actually is possible, as the Imam said, we could have completely made this conversion by spending less money than we spent on war in the last 2 decades. Let's suppose, just for a moment, that it's possible to really go on a footing which allows us to all work together to say, okay, enough of this. Our purpose is to live our lives in a way that glorifies our Creator. We are going to stop destroying the earth. We're going to stop using the atmosphere as an open sewer. We're going to stop taking away hope from all of the children to come. We're going to save our human future. Let's suppose that we really made up our minds to do that. Here's what the scientists say. The latest report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, has dire warnings of what would happen if we don't stop polluting the Earth's atmosphere. But they also say this: if we reach true net zero and stop adding any human-caused greenhouse gas emissions, the temperature of the Earth will stop going up with a lag time of as little as 3 years. So, blocking out the sky, creating a world in which our children will never again see the stars at night, when the plants would be deprived of photosynthesis, the solar panels rendered less capable, all we have to do is to stop using the sky as a sewer, and the temperature will stop going up without that madness. And here's the other finding they presented just a few months ago. If we stay at true net zero, 50% of all the human-caused CO2 that's in the sky accumulated now will fall out of the atmosphere in as little as 25 to 30 years. Removed by Mother Nature in volumes vastly greater than these hugely expensive new CO2 sucking machines can pull it back down. If we just stop digging the hole we're in, if we just stop making it worse, the temperature will stop going up and the earth will begin to heal itself. Now, I've asked you to imagine that future is possible. It feels impossible now, but it's not. Remember the words of Nelson Mandela when he said, "It always seems impossible until it's done." And the effort to end apartheid in South Africa was a movement morally based that went through times of great despair. The movement for civil rights in this country, the movement earlier for women's suffrage, the movement earlier still for abolition, the movement more recently for freedom and justice for lesbian, gays, and transgender Americans. All of those movements went through periods where the fiercest advocates were vulnerable to moments of despair. But they kept on going. And with all of those prior morally based movements, there came a time when there was an epiphany, where people realized all the underbrush was cleared away and the central issue was a choice between what's right and what's wrong. That's what the interfaith movement focuses us all on, the choice between right and wrong. And interfaith movements in the time of climate crisis focuses us on the choice between what is right to save our future or what is wrong to give in to despair and lethargy and inertia and just assume that it's impossible. It is possible. We have everything we need except for one element, and that is political will. But remember this, political will is itself a renewable resource. Thank you, and thank you for putting on this wonderful forum.
To evangelist, Vice President Al Gore, we really appreciate it. We thank all of you for coming out tonight. We're going to encourage you to go to our website, interfaithamerica.org. Look up the Black Interfaith in the Time of Climate Crisis. Get our toolkit, put it to use. We want to stop digging the hole. We want to help to be at the root cause of this, to address the root causes. As Karenna said, we want to be both. We want to be prophetic, we want to be pastoral, we want to be practical. If you go to our website, interfaithamerica.org, Black Interfaith in the Time of Climate Crisis, look for the toolkit. It will help you do that. Thanks all of you for coming out tonight. Really appreciate it, and we look forward to working with all of you in the future. Thank you.